50 years ago, on the 22nd of November 1963, was a momentous occasion. A momentous occasion that shook the world. It was, of course, the assassination of President Kennedy. Today we're going to look at some of the implications of that, and in particular, what happened next when Vice President Johnson took over the presidency. And we're going to look at some of the lessons learned. Now, Jon Chapman has made a special study of the history of this period and the leadership implications. Jon, tell me some more of the context.
Well, I was 8 years old when it happened, and I can remember the shockwave that went around the world when we opened the newspapers on a Sunday morning and saw these horrific pictures. And of course, that tells us something about the impact of the event and what was going on. We were in the middle of the Cold War. There was a real fear that somehow the assassination and the conflict with the Soviet Union were connected, that there was some kind of plot, and that the whole of the United States politics was going to be destabilized. And so there was a real sense of crisis. For Johnson himself, of course, he'd been vice president for 3 years and had been pretty much sidelined for those 3 years because he'd been seen as and he was the main political rival for Kennedy. He'd taken the job against the advice of his friends and advisors who'd said, if you take that job, it'll be the end of your political career. And the Kennedys pretty much made it so. He was sidelined, he was cut out of meetings, he was actually turned into a figure of fun. And as a result, he spent 3 years in the political wilderness thinking pretty much his political career was over. And it's at this moment that, of course, everything changes. And suddenly he finds himself stepping into this job in the most extreme and extraordinary circumstance.
So, not at all a promising start. How did things develop?
It's interesting, and it's as if those 3 years in the wilderness taught him something about self-control. Johnson had always been a very ebullient, difficult man, a very, very hard man to work for and work with. But those 3 years, he seems to have actually learned how to manage his own emotions and manage his own anxieties. And people notice, almost within an hour of this event happening, how all of a sudden he goes into this extraordinary calm space and manages to find the wherewithal to take calm control of when everyone around him is pretty much panicking. And that's the first thing that one notices is this extraordinary level of detached calm that he has.
So what happens next after that? So the next period clearly is crucial.
Yes, and it's interesting to look at it on different levels of leadership. So there's an immediate challenge of how to manage the transition and reassure people that it's business as usual. And he goes about this actually in quite a callous way. He insists that Jackie Kennedy is alongside him on Air Force One as they're flying back with the president's body to Washington. He insists that she's with him as he's sworn in order to demonstrate continuity between the Kennedy administration and whatever his administration is going to be. And people are quite shocked, those around him, by the coolness with which he does these things. At another level, he's very considerate of the immediate problem surrounding those who have been very loyal advisors to Kennedy, who actually have had no time for Johnson, and whose immediate response to the aftermath of the assassination is to actually want to resign and leave. And he manages through assiduous, constant cajoling and persuasion to persuade most of these characters to stay. And it's managing that continuity which helps his sort of proto-administration enormously in those early days and weeks.
Now, we can link a lot of what happened there to other leaders that have taken over from very charismatic, almost dazzling presences. I'm thinking of Steve Jobs when he died and Tim Cook took over, Margaret Thatcher when John Major took over. What are the lessons we can learn that we can apply as a leader?
Well, I think one of the lessons is to think about the different realms of leadership that you need to manage. So there's the immediate task, what needs to be done. what are the challenges being faced today? And then there's the team. How are you going to lead the team? And of course, again, Johnson had to pull this team together, and they were all in shock, and some of them had no time for him. And then there's the broader leadership in terms of the overall vision that's been presented to the administration and to the country and to the world. And one thing Johnson does quite early on is he manages to determine what he's in the presidency for. In other words, he gets his vision and he starts to apply it. And there's a moment where his advisors say, this is something you shouldn't be doing because it's going to spend all your political capital. And he says, well, what's the presidency for if I can't actually deliver what I believe in? What he believes in that moment is the Civil Rights Act and social justice. And it's a real turning point in American history, the point at which these major programs start to be put into motion.
Are there any other lessons we can pick out from this, quite a difficult time, really, that Johnson must have gone through?
Well, one is to expect the unexpected. And Johnson clearly had in his mind what he would do if the job ever became his. And there's that moment where it suddenly does become his in a very unexpected and shocking way. He's able to step in and say, well, I know what I would have done in this circumstance. These are the priorities. So scenario planning is one thing. Another thing is, I've already mentioned this extraordinary self-control and self-management. It's a really important emotional skill for people. It's not just about expressing what you're feeling, it's about channeling what you're feeling. And Johnson does that with extraordinary skill. And finally, I think there's something around managing stakeholders. Johnson knows, as he goes into that job, what's holding up Kennedy's legislative program. His advice so far has been ignored, but he knows what he needs to do. He tackles the key stakeholders in Congress, and he gets his legislative program through in a way, actually, that Kennedy might never have been able to do. And so it's that hard organisational skill, knowing the stakeholders, knowing the people, knowing what they want and how to get what you want in return. That's really part of what Johnson does extraordinarily well.
Jon, that's very insightful. Thank you very much. You've helped bring history back to the present day.
You're welcome.